For 872 days, the world believed Leningrad was dying in slow motion, sealed off with no escape. In January 1943, a narrow frozen corridor became the only thing standing between survival and extinction. What happened in that strip of land changed the fate of an entire city and the balance of the war in the north. By the end of 1941, the ring around Leningrad had fully closed. German Army Group North had advanced from the south and southeast, while Finnish forces halted along the old pre-war border to the north. Overland supply routes were severed, rail lines were cut. The city, with a population exceeding 3 million including refugees, was isolated except for a narrow corridor across Lake Ladoga. On 8 September 1941, the fall of Shlisselburg on the Neva River eliminated the final direct land connection between Leningrad and the rest of Soviet territory, formally beginning the siege. The German command did not attempt an immediate urban assault. Instead, the strategy adopted was one of encirclement and attrition. Directive No. 1601, issued by the German High Command in September 1941, explicitly rejected storming the city and proposed its destruction through blockade and artillery fire. Heavy artillery units, including batteries of 210 mm and 305 mm caliber, were deployed to bombard industrial districts, rail yards, and power stations. Luftflotte 1 conducted repeated air raids aimed at fuel depots and food warehouses. On 8 September, a major bombing strike ignited the body of food warehouses, destroying several thousand tons of stored supplies. On the Soviet side, the responsibility for the city's defense initially fell to the Leningrad Front, commanded at various stages by Kliment Voroshilov and later Georgy Zhukov. By mid-September 1941, approximately 540,000 Red Army troops were deployed in and around the city. These included elements of the 42nd Army defending southern approaches, the 55th Army on the coastal sector, and the 23rd Army along the Karelian Isthmus. The Baltic Fleet, trapped in the harbors of Kronstadt and Leningrad, contributed naval artillery support using heavy ship guns removed from cruisers and battleships. The logistics situation deteriorated rapidly. By October 1941, daily bread rations were cut to 400 grams for industrial workers and 300 grams for dependents. By November, these figures fell to 250 grams and 125 grams respectively. These rations were based on flour heavily diluted with cellulose and other substitutes. Fuel shortages immobilized most public transport and shut down residential heating as winter temperatures dropped below -20 degrees Celsius. The only remaining lifeline was Lake Ladoga. As the water froze in late November, a supply route known as the Road of Life was established across the ice. In the first winter alone, between December 1941 and March 1942, approximately 360,000 tons of cargo were transported into the city, including food, ammunition, and fuel. In the opposite direction, more than 550,000 civilians were evacuated. Convoys on the ice were subject to constant air attack. German aircraft recorded over 300 bombing sorties against Ladoga crossings during the winter. Inside the city, industrial production continued under extreme conditions. Factories such as the Kirov plant maintained output of artillery pieces, mortars, and tanks, despite electricity outages and staff losses due to hunger and illness. Civil defense units dismantled unexploded bombs and repaired power lines under continuous shell fire. By early 1942, the official death toll within the city from starvation, exposure, and bombing had reached more than 600,000, though later archival assessments placed the number substantially higher. Both sides adjusted to a long siege reality. German forces reinforced their defensive perimeter instead of preparing for an assault. Soviet command increasingly viewed the blockade not as a static condition, but as a front line that could be breached with sufficient concentration of forces. Throughout 1942, limited offensive attempts from the Volkhov and Leningrad fronts failed to reopen a permanent land corridor, but they inflicted steady attritional losses on the besieging forces and forced the German command to divert reinforcements that were needed elsewhere. By the end of 1942, the strategic environment around Leningrad had begun to shift. The German defeat at Stalingrad disrupted overall operational planning on the Eastern Front. Soviet forces gained greater freedom to prepare coordinated offensives. Within the High Command, the concept of fully lifting the siege gave way to a more immediate goal: breaking the blockade at its narrowest point along the southern shore of Lake Ladoga, where German and Soviet lines lay less than 16 kilometers apart. In early January 1943, conditions around Leningrad reflected 16 months of continuous blockade warfare. German 18th Army held the southern arc of the siege, with its strongest formations deployed between Schlisselburg and Sinyavino. The Soviet side concentrated two major groupings for an upcoming operation: the Leningrad front inside the city and the Volkov front east of the German lines. Their objective was limited but precise: to force a breakthrough across the narrow land corridor along the southern shore of Lake Ladoga and restore a permanent ground connection to the city. The Soviet plan assigned the main assault role to the 67th Army of the Leningrad Front and the 2nd Shock Army of the Volkov Front. Together, they fielded approximately 302,000 personnel for the operation. The German forces opposing them consisted primarily of the 26th Army Corps and parts of the 54th Corps, amounting to roughly 70,000 to 75,000 soldiers, supported by fortified positions constructed over more than a year. The German defensive zone was reinforced with concrete bunkers, anti-tank obstacles, minefields, and interlocking artillery fire. Soviet reconnaissance throughout December 1942 mapped German trenches, gun placements, and command posts. Engineers prepared assault crossings of the frozen Neva River, the principal natural barrier separating the city from the Sinyavino Heights. More than 200 artillery batteries were secretly positioned along the Leningrad front sector alone, including heavy howitzers of 152 mm and 203 mm caliber. On the Volkov front side, large stockpiles of ammunition and bridging equipment were assembled under forest cover. The operational timing was determined by both strategic pressure and environmental constraints. The frozen ground enabled movement of armor and heavy guns, but it also exposed attackers to open terrain dominated by German firing lanes. The success of the operation depended on synchronized attack, massed artillery preparation, and rapid exploitation before German mobile reserves could react. On the German side, defensive command underestimated the scale of the Soviet buildup. German intelligence assessed that Soviet forces could mount only local diversionary attacks rather than a coordinated offensive. Although defensive positions were strong, German reserves in the sector were limited. Armored support consisted primarily of assault guns and depleted tank detachments held behind the line for counterattacks. At 0930 on 12th of January 1943, the Soviet artillery preparation began. More than 4,500 guns and mortars opened fire along a front of approximately 15 kilometers. The bombardment continued for over 2 hours, targeting German trench systems, communication nodes, artillery batteries, and supply routes. Simultaneously, long-range artillery from within Leningrad fired across the Neva to suppress enemy positions east of the river. Luftwaffe opposition was limited during the opening phase due to weather conditions and the density of Soviet anti-aircraft fire. Following the artillery barrage, assault units of the 67th Army began crossing the frozen Neva under continuous machine gun and mortar fire. Infantry advanced in tightly coordinated assault groups supported by close-range artillery fire and direct-fire tank guns positioned at the riverbank. Initial penetration was achieved in several sectors, but progress remained slow due to deep snow, minefields, and intact German strongpoints. East of the German lines, the 2nd Shock Army attacked simultaneously toward the west. Its advance was uneven. Some divisions broke through the 1st and 2nd lines of German defense within the initial 48 hours, while others were stalled by concentrated artillery and counterfire from elevated positions near Sinyavino. German units conducted localized counterattacks to seal breaches, often deploying assault groups built around machine gun and anti-tank teams. By 14th of January, Soviet forces had created 2 expanding salients from opposite directions, separated by less than 10 kilometers. The narrowing gap intensified pressure on the German central position, which now faced the risk of encirclement. Both sides reinforced continuously. Soviet command committed additional rifle divisions, engineer brigades, and tank regiments to sustain momentum. German command transferred elements of the 96th and 61st Infantry Divisions from quieter sectors to block the breakthrough. The first phase of the operation demonstrated that the blockade could be challenged through concentrated firepower and coordinated multi-front assault. But it also confirmed that the German defensive system would not collapse from shock alone. The battle now entered a phase where success depended on sustained pressure, rapid logistics support, and the ability to absorb heavy losses on both sides as the two Soviet fronts pushed toward physical contact. The strategic planning for the January 1943 operation was shaped by the failure of earlier attempts to break the blockade in 1941 and 1942. Previous offensives, including the Lyuban and Sinyavino operations, had resulted in high losses without permanent results. By late 1942, Soviet High Command reassessed the problem and narrowed the objective. Instead of attempting to encircle German 18th Army or liberate the entire region, the new plan focused on opening a narrow but stable land corridor along the southern shore of Lake Ladoga. This would allow continuous rail and road supply to Leningrad for the first time since September 1941. The operation was designated Iskra. Overall coordination was assigned to the Leningrad and Volkhov fronts under the supervision of representatives of Stavka. The primary Soviet objective was to link the 67th Army advancing from the west with the 2nd Shock Army attacking from the east. Secondary objectives included securing the Sinyavino Heights to prevent German artillery observation over the corridor and stabilizing the southern perimeter of the city. For the Soviets, logistics planning became a central priority. Ammunition stockpiles were increased to sustain at least 10 days of continuous offensive operations. Fuel and food reserves were positioned close to forward areas using night transport and camouflage depots. Engineers constructed hundreds of artillery firing positions and prepared over 20 ice crossings over the Neva for infantry, armor, and supply traffic. Field hospitals were placed within short evacuation distance, anticipating casualty figures based on previous winter campaigns. The Soviet artillery plan emphasized layered fire. Heavy batteries were tasked with counter-battery missions and destruction of permanent German fortifications. Medium artillery was assigned to suppress German infantry positions during the assault, while mortars and direct fire guns supported advancing rifle units. The air component was assigned to interdict German reserve movement and supply traffic along rail lines leading toward Muga and Sinyavino. German operational planning at this stage was primarily defensive. German 18th Army had converted the Schlisselburg-Sinyavino sector into a fortified zone based on a series of depth positions rather than a continuous front line. Their doctrine relied on allowing limited penetrations followed by localized counterattacks. However, by January 1943, German reserve strength was restricted. Mobile formations had been withdrawn earlier for operations in southern sectors, and armored units in the Leningrad area consisted mainly of assault gun battalions with limited operational reach. German logistical conditions were also deteriorating. Supply lines ran through congested rail hubs in the rear that were increasingly exposed to Soviet air interdiction. Winter storms disrupted transport, and replacement flows to the front were insufficient to offset cumulative losses since 1941. Although German command expected localized Soviet attacks, it assessed that large-scale coordinated operations across the entire corridor were unlikely due to previous Soviet failures. Both sides understood the tactical importance of the terrain. The corridor between Lake Ladoga and the Sinyavino Heights measured less than 20 kilometers at its narrowest point, dominated by forests, marshes, and low ridgelines. In winter, frozen ground simplified movement but erased natural concealment. Any large force crossing open snowfields became vulnerable to direct observation and artillery fire. The Soviet plan relied heavily on suppressive fire and night movement to reduce exposure. The timing of the operation reflected broader strategic considerations. In the south, Soviet forces were preparing for major counteroffensives following the encirclement of German 6th Army at Stalingrad. German command had redeployed reserves toward that front, further limiting its ability to reinforce Leningrad. For the Soviets, Opening the Ladoga corridor would stabilize the northern theater and free forces for later operations in 1943. Propaganda objectives also shaped planning. Soviet leadership intended any success at Leningrad to demonstrate that the blockade could be reversed. German propaganda remained focused on the city as a symbol of resistance that had not yet been crushed. Both sides saw the upcoming operation as having political significance beyond its narrow military dimensions. By early January, operational orders were finalized. The assault timetable established synchronized breakthroughs from both sides with precise artillery schedules and prearranged axis of advance for rifle and tank units. Communications plans emphasized redundancy due to the expected destruction of command lines during the initial bombardment. Despite extensive preparation, Soviet planners acknowledged the risk that the German defense could absorb the first shock and force the battle into prolonged positional fighting. The stage was fully set for a concentrated effort, unlike any previous attempt at Leningrad. The coming engagement would test not only the feasibility of the breakthrough, but also the ability of two independent fronts to execute coordinated, high-intensity combat under extreme winter conditions. The first ground engagements following the initial artillery preparation unfolded along a fragmented front defined by forests, frozen swamps, and fortified villages. On the western side, assault units of the 67th Army crossed the Neva in several sectors between Marino and Schlisselburg. The river, frozen to a depth sufficient for infantry and light armor, was still exposed to direct fire from German machine gun nests positioned along elevated banks. Soviet assault groups advanced in successive waves, using smoke screens and close artillery support to suppress German strongpoints. Casualties during the first crossings were immediate, particularly among engineer detachments clearing lanes through minefields. By the end of 12 January, Soviet forces secured shallow bridgeheads across the river at several points. In some sectors, penetration reached 1.5 to 2 kilometers into the German 1st Defensive Belt. German units of the 170th and 227th Infantry Divisions conducted localized counterattacks with infantry supported by assault guns, attempting to seal breaches before Soviet reserves could exploit them. These counterattacks achieved limited success in delaying the advance, but failed to eliminate the bridgeheads entirely. East of the German positions, the Second Shock Army began its offensive toward the west from the Volkov sector. Its divisions encountered a layered German defense anchored on fortified nodes around Lipka, Gorodok, and the forest lines south of Muga. Advancing over open snowfields, Soviet infantry faced concentrated fire from well-camouflaged machine gun and anti-tank gun positions. Several initial attacks stalled after advancing only a few hundred meters. Artillery support was repeatedly adjusted to target identified firing points, producing gradual but costly gains. On 13 January, Soviet commanders committed tank units into the bridgeheads near Schlisselburg. T-34 and KV-1 tanks pushed forward along narrow cleared lanes, engaging German bunkers and field gun positions at close range. The confined terrain limited maneuver, and several tanks were immobilized by mines or anti-tank fire. Despite losses, armored support allowed infantry formations to overrun multiple trench systems and secure parts of Schlisselburg's eastern outskirts. German command recognized the seriousness of the breakthrough attempts and requested immediate reinforcement. The 61st and 96th Infantry Divisions were ordered to redeploy toward the threatened sector, though movement delays caused by Soviet air interdiction and winter road conditions slowed their arrival. German artillery units intensified counter-battery fire, targeting Soviet gun positions on the west bank of the Neva and in the forests east of the corridor. Civilian impact increased as the fighting approached inhabited areas. Villages along the line of advance had been largely evacuated earlier, but small civilian groups remained in cellars and shelters. Buildings were converted into firing positions by both armies. Fires caused by artillery strikes spread rapidly in wooden structures despite deep snow cover. By 14th January, Soviet penetration from the west exceeded 4 kilometers in several areas. The fortified workers' settlement number 8 and nearby defensive clusters fell under Soviet control after repeated frontal assaults supported by heavy artillery. On the eastern axis, the Second Shock Army achieved uneven progress. Some rifle divisions advanced up to 3 kilometers, while adjacent units remained pinned by German fire. The gap between the two advancing Soviet formations narrowed to less than 10 kilometers. Morale on both sides reflected the intensity of the engagement. Soviet units reported optimism linked to visible territorial gains and the perception that the German line was beginning to bend. German frontline reports emphasized mounting pressure, shortages of ammunition in forward strongpoints, and the increasing difficulty of rotating exhausted units under continuous artillery fire. German counterattacks continued throughout 14 and 15 January, often conducted by reinforced battalions supported by self-propelled guns. These efforts temporarily restored parts of the front line, but failed to achieve a decisive reversal. Each regained position was subjected to renewed Soviet bombardment, followed by infantry assaults. The early engagements demonstrated that the German defense could be penetrated but only through sustained pressure and heavy expenditure of manpower and material. The battle transitioned from initial shock action into a grinding contest for successive strongpoints, where progress was measured in hundreds of meters rather than kilometers. The narrowing gap between the two Soviet fronts now represented both opportunity and risk. If contact could be achieved, the land blockade would be broken. If momentum stalled, the Germans would retain the ability to isolate and destroy the advancing salients. By mid-January 1943, the outcome of the opening phase remained undecided. Both sides had committed major elements of their available forces. The fighting now escalated into a critical phase where persistence, reinforcement capacity, and coordination would determine whether the breakthrough would become permanent or collapse under counterpressure. By 16th January 1943, the battle entered a phase of full escalation. Both the Leningrad and Volkhov fronts committed additional formations to sustain pressure on the narrowing German defensive corridor. Soviet strength in the breakthrough sector rose to approximately 350,000 troops as reserve rifle divisions, tank brigades, and artillery regiments were fed into the fight. Daily ammunition expenditure reached levels comparable to major summer offensives, despite the winter conditions. German forces in the threatened sector were reinforced to roughly 90,000 to 95,000 personnel, drawing on units transferred from quieter sectors and rear area security formations. The struggle concentrated around a series of fortified settlements and forest strongpoints that controlled movement through the corridor. Workers' Settlement Number 5, Number 6, and the defensive node at Gorodok became focal points of repeated assaults. These positions were defended by layered trench networks, concrete shelters, and mutually supporting machine gun nests. Soviet infantry attacks were preceded by heavy fire from 122 mm and 152 mm artillery, followed by close-range combat involving grenades, flamethrowers, and submachine gun detachments. Gains were measured in single defensive lines rather than territorial depth. German command attempted to stabilize the situation through rotational counterattacks. Assault groups built around Sturmgeschütz 3 assault guns were used to counter Soviet penetrations. These formations achieved temporary tactical success in restoring localized defensive integrity, but suffered steady losses due to anti-tank rifles, artillery direct fire, and improvised close-quarters attacks. German artillery units faced growing difficulties in maintaining consistent fire support due to supply interruptions and damage to communication lines. Weather conditions increasingly affected both sides. Daytime temperatures fluctuated between -10 and -20 degrees Celsius. Weapons mechanisms malfunctioned from frost accumulation, and casualties from frostbite rose, particularly among wounded men awaiting evacuation. Snowdrifts slowed supply movement, further straining forward units. Medical evacuation depended largely on sleds and narrow winter roads exposed to artillery fire. The civilian impact during this phase intensified. Although most of the immediate combat zone was already depopulated, scattered civilians caught behind defensive lines faced renewed displacement as villages changed hands. Food shortages remained acute in Leningrad, despite the partial easing of supply movement across the ice road over Lake Ladoga. The hope generated by the offensive had not yet translated into immediate relief for the civilian population inside the city. Politically, the operation began drawing increased attention from higher command levels. Soviet leadership monitored daily situation reports with direct interest in the progress of the corridor. The objective was no longer framed solely as tactical, but also as a demonstration of strategic reversal in the north after the developments at Stalingrad. German command, facing expanding crises across multiple fronts, evaluated whether the commitment of further reserves to Leningrad was sustainable. By 17 January, the gap between the 67th Army and the 2nd Shock Army had narrowed to approximately 6 kilometers. German central defensive units, primarily elements of the 170th Infantry Division and ad hoc battle groups, were now under simultaneous pressure from east and west. Continuous artillery fire disrupted coordination and prevented the organized movement of reinforcements between threatened sectors. Losses continued to rise steadily. Soviet daily casualty figures in the breakthrough zone increased into the thousands, reflecting the cost of frontal attacks against entrenched positions. German losses also mounted, especially among frontline battalions tasked with holding shrinking defensive perimeters. Precise numbers varied by sector, but reports from both commands indicated that some battalions had been reduced to less than half of their original strength. The escalation phase confirmed that the corridor could not be opened through maneuver warfare alone. Progress depended on the exhaustion of German defensive capacity through sustained attrition. At the same time, the continued forward movement of Soviet assault formations placed increasing strain on their own logistics and replacement systems. The battle approached a decisive point where either the remaining German central defenses would collapse under converging pressure, or the offensive would stall under its own losses and supply limitations. By the third week of January 1943, the fighting reached its highest intensity as both sides committed the bulk of their available forces into a confined space less than 5 kilometers wide. The main axis of Soviet advance converged on the central German defensive cluster between worker settlements number 1 and number 5. These positions controlled the last continuous German corridor between Lake Ladoga and the Sinyavino Heights. Their loss would remove the final barrier separating the 67th Army and the 2nd Shock Army. Soviet artillery concentration reached its maximum during this phase. More than 300 guns per kilometer of front were employed at selected breakthrough points. Heavy howitzers engaged German bunkers at direct fire ranges, while Katyusha rocket launchers delivered saturation strikes against trench systems and forest assembly areas. Air support increased as weather conditions improved. Ground attack aircraft targeted German supply routes and rear area artillery positions near Muga and Sinyavino. On 18 and 19 January, Soviet infantry assaults were launched in continuous waves. Units attacked in tightly packed formations due to limited maneuver space and the need to maintain cohesion under intense fire. Engineer detachments operated directly behind the first assault waves, clearing lanes through anti-tank obstacles and minefields under live fire. Casualties among these teams were disproportionately high. Tank support remained constrained by terrain, but armored units were used aggressively, wherever narrow corridors permitted advance. German command concentrated the remnants of several infantry regiments along the threatened central sector. Defensive tactics emphasized elastic defense. Forward strongpoints were ordered to delay as long as possible and then withdraw to secondary positions once overrun. However, Soviet attack tempo and density disrupted this plan. Withdrawals frequently turned into disorganized retreats under artillery fire, resulting in localized encirclements of German platoons and companies. By the evening of 19th January, Soviet forward units from the west and east were separated by less than 2 kilometers. German reserves committed into the gap included elements of the 61st Infantry Division and assault gun detachments pulled from adjacent sectors. These counterattacks slowed the Soviet advance, but could not restore a continuous defensive front. German units now operated under conditions of broken communications and increasingly fragmented command. The civilian situation inside Leningrad remained critical, but showed first tangible signs of change. While the city was still under artillery fire and full blockade conditions, Soviet command began preparing immediate logistical exploitation measures for the corridor once contact was achieved. Railway troops, bridge engineers, and supply battalions were positioned behind the advancing fronts in anticipation of rapid construction work under fire. On 20th of January, the last coherent German defensive positions in the central sector collapsed following a concentrated artillery strike and coordinated assault by rifle units of both fronts. Soviet troops entered the contested forest corridor from multiple directions, encountering scattered German resistance rather than organized defense. The first physical contact between forward elements of the 67th Army and the 2nd Shock Army occurred during the night of 20 to 24 January in the vicinity of Workers' Settlement No. 1. German attempts to re-establish a blocking line after the contact failed due to the absence of sufficient organized reserves. Counterattacks launched by ad hoc battle groups achieved only brief tactical effects. Soviet artillery interdicted all major movement routes through the corridor, preventing redeployment of German heavy weapons into effective blocking positions. Losses during the peak phase of the campaign were severe on both sides. Soviet frontline divisions reported reductions of 30 to 50% in rifle strength over a period of 5 to 7 days. German units holding the central sector reported battalion strengths reduced to 150 to 300 men, far below established combat establishment. Medical evacuation was continuously disrupted by fire and terrain conditions, compounding the impact of casualties. The convergence of the two Soviet fronts marked the fulfillment of the core operational objective. For the first time since September 1941, a continuous land connection between Leningrad and the main Soviet-controlled territory was physically established. Although the corridor remained narrow and under fire, its existence fundamentally altered the strategic situation in the northern sector. The peak of the campaign demonstrated that the blockade could be challenged through sustained concentration of force, heavy attrition, and multi-front coordination. At the same time, the price of this achievement revealed the scale of material and human resources required to overcome a deeply entrenched positional defense. The battle now transitioned from breakthrough to consolidation, as both sides adjusted to the new operational reality created by the breach. Following the physical link-up of the two Soviet fronts, the character of the fighting shifted from breakthrough operations to consolidation under continuous counterpressure. German command, facing the loss of the primary blocking line, reorganized surviving elements into improvised defensive groups tasked with containing the newly formed corridor. These units operated without a stable front line, relying on mobile strongpoints, artillery harassment, and localized counterattacks against Soviet flanks and supply routes. German adaptations focused on firepower concentration rather than terrain control. Artillery units redeployed to positions south of Sinyavino and east of Emga, where remaining observation points allowed indirect fire into the corridor. Heavy guns targeted newly established Soviet supply nodes, river crossings, and road junctions. Luftwaffe activity also increased as weather conditions improved, with strike aircraft attempting to disrupt corridor construction and rear area traffic. Sortie rates remained limited due to fuel shortages and growing Soviet air defense density. On the Soviet side, resistance and adaptation took the form of immediate engineering operations under combat conditions. Railway construction brigades advanced directly behind the forward troops, laying track segments as soon as terrain was secured. Temporary roadways were built over snow and frozen marshland using timber, rails, and compacted ice. Pontoon bridges and reinforced ice crossings were installed to accommodate heavier supply traffic. These efforts were conducted under intermittent German artillery fire, producing casualties among non-combat engineering units. Soviet infantry units transitioned from assault posture to corridor security missions. Rifle regiments were redeployed to guard key intersections, railway junctions, and bridge sites. Defensive networks were established around workers' settlements, Nosen 1, 5, and 8, to protect the narrow land link from possible cutoff attempts. Anti-tank units were positioned to cover access routes from the south, anticipating German efforts to isolate the corridor with armored counterattacks. Psychological strain intensified on both sides. Soviet troops, having achieved the operational goal, now faced the pressure of holding a narrow corridor where loss of position could reverse weeks of fighting. German frontline units experienced a sharp decline in cohesion due to cumulative losses, fragmented command, and diminishing belief in the strategic value of continued resistance in the sector. Interrogation reports captured during this phase indicated growing skepticism among German soldiers about the viability of defending a shrinking perimeter while the broader front continued to deteriorate. Despite the physical breach, the corridor remained under continuous fire. German artillery maintained pressure on transport routes, particularly along the shoreline of Lake Ladoga and the newly laid rail lines. Supply convoys suffered regular losses from shelling and air attack. The corridor width at its narrowest points remained under 10 kilometers, placing nearly all traffic within range of German guns. Soviet counter-battery efforts gradually suppressed some firing positions, but complete neutralization proved difficult due to the dispersed nature of German gun emplacements. German counterattacks during this phase were conducted with reduced numerical strength but high local intensity. Assault groups built around remaining Sturmgeschütz units and infantry detachments launched repeated thrusts toward the corridor's southern shoulder. These attacks rarely exceeded battalion strength and lacked sustained logistical support. While some penetrations reached Soviet outer security lines, none achieved operational depth. Soviet reserves and artillery rapidly stabilized threatened sectors. Civilians in Leningrad began to experience measurable changes. Although full relief remained distant, the physical existence of the corridor allowed immediate expansion of supply movement beyond reliance on ice road convoys alone. Daily food delivery capacity began to increase incrementally, though ration levels remained below pre-blockade norms. Evacuation of weakened civilians and wounded expanded as rail access slowly improved under fire. The adaptation phase underscored that breaking the blockade line did not immediately eliminate German operational capability in the region. Both armies entered a new contest centered on endurance, protection of logistics, and gradual positional realignment rather than rapid maneuver. The corridor existed but remained vulnerable, and its survival depended on continuous reinforcement, engineering resilience, and the ability to absorb sustained artillery and air pressure. This stage of the operation marked the transition from breakthrough victory to a longer struggle for operational stability. The ability of the Soviet forces to adapt faster than the German defenders would determine whether the corridor became a permanent feature of the front or remained a tenuous connection subject to renewed isolation. The turning point of the campaign was defined not by a single dramatic engagement, but by the irreversible shift in operational balance that followed the successful convergence of the two Soviet fronts. Once continuous contact had been established and the corridor secured against immediate collapse, German command faced a structural limitation that could not be corrected by local counteraction. The blockade of Leningrad as a closed operational system no longer existed. In the final days of January 1943, German attempts to restore the former blocking line decreased in scale and coordination. Assault groups launched against the southern edge of the corridor failed to achieve sustained penetration. Artillery fire remained intense, but increasingly lacked the concentrated direction necessary for decisive interdiction. Observation posts lost during the Soviet advance reduced the effectiveness of German fire control, forcing many batteries to operate based on pre-registered targets rather than real-time correction. Soviet command initiated the formal stabilization phase of the operation. Additional rifle formations were moved into the corridor zone to expand its defensive depth. The width of the land connection was gradually increased through limited offensive actions designed to push German forces farther south from the Ladoga shoreline. These actions were not intended as deep penetrations, but as incremental adjustments to reduce German observation and artillery reach into the corridor. By early February 1943, the corridor width approached 12 to 15 kilometers at several points. This expansion decreased the vulnerability of transport routes and allowed for more flexible deployment of logistics and rear area infrastructure. The first continuous railway connection between Leningrad and the main Soviet network became operational within weeks under direct military protection. Rail traffic initially operated at reduced capacity, but represented a permanent change in the sustainment of the city. German command formally reassessed the northern theater following the failure to reimpose the blockade. The strategic priority of Leningrad diminished in comparison with crises in the south and center of the Eastern Front. Elements of German 18th Army were gradually reassigned to defensive operations rather than offensive containment. The corridor remained under fire, but the capacity to isolate the city had been decisively undermined. For the civilian population, the effects of the turning point were delayed but measurable. Food rationing levels began to rise incrementally during February and March 1943 as rail and road throughput stabilized. Although conditions remained severe and malnutrition widespread, the long-term projection of total starvation as the only outcome was no longer valid. Medical evacuation, fuel delivery, and industrial resupply slowly increased, enabling partial restoration of essential urban functions. On the Soviet side, the turning point reinforced a shift in strategic planning. With the Northern Front stabilized at a reduced crisis level, resources could be redistributed to major operations elsewhere. Leningrad ceased to be a theater defined exclusively by existential defense and became a functioning anchor of the Northern Front. For German forces, the turning point marked the transition from containment to positional endurance. Their remaining units in the sector adapted to prolonged defensive warfare without expectation of regaining the former siege geometry. The loss of the continuous block was accepted as operationally irreversible, even as localized fighting continued. The key consequence of the turning point was not territorial depth, but structural change. The front geometry, supply mechanics, and strategic priorities of both armies were permanently altered. The blockade existed only as a diminished pressure system rather than a closed siege. From this moment forward, the question was no longer whether Leningrad could be reconnected to the Soviet interior, but how quickly its full logistical integration could be restored under combat conditions. The end of large-scale combat operations in the corridor zone unfolded gradually rather than through a formal cessation of hostilities. By late January and early February 1943, both sides transitioned from continuous assault activity to positional engagement along newly stabilized lines. German forces withdrew from forward blocking positions north of the Signavino Heights and reorganized along a shortened defensive arc south of the corridor. This withdrawal was conducted in stages under artillery cover, with rearguard units delaying Soviet pressure while main elements regrouped on prepared fallback positions. German evacuation of isolated strongpoints continued into early February. Units that had become partially encircled during the collapse of the central defensive sector were extracted through forest routes under constant fire. Equipment losses during these withdrawals were substantial, especially in heavy weapons that could not be moved across snowbound terrain under Soviet artillery observation. Abandoned guns, vehicles, and ammunition stocks were recorded by advancing Soviet units across former German positions. Soviet forces did not conduct deep pursuit during this phase. Their primary objective shifted to securing the corridor against renewed isolation, rather than forcing immediate operational expansion. Rifle divisions rotated forward units into defense, while rear formations replenished ammunition and personnel. Engineer units continued large-scale efforts to reinforce bridges, rail beds, and road networks to ensure uninterrupted traffic between Leningrad and the interior. The immediate humanitarian effect of the restored land connection became visible within weeks. Railway evacuation of civilians expanded beyond emergency cases. Tens of thousands of severely malnourished residents, children, and medical patients were transported out of the city through February and March 1943. At the same time, inbound rail traffic carried food, coal, medical supplies, and industrial equipment. Daily supply tonnage rose steadily, reducing dependence on the ice road over Lake Ladoga, which had previously served as the primary winter lifeline. German artillery and air activity against the corridor continued intermittently into the spring. Shelling targeted junction stations, loading areas, and transport convoys. However, the intensity of these attacks declined as German forces faced growing resource constraints and increasing pressure on other fronts. Soviet air defense density expanded rapidly along the corridor, further reducing the effectiveness of German interdiction. Casualty accounting during the aftermath revealed the cumulative toll of the operation. Soviet losses during the January breakthrough phase numbered in the tens of thousands of killed and wounded. German losses, including killed, wounded, captured, and missing, also reached significant figures across the defending divisions. Exact numbers varied by source and unit, but reflected months of attritional combat compressed into a matter of weeks. Civilian conditions inside Leningrad slowly stabilized, but remained precarious. Mortality rates began to decline from the extreme levels recorded during the winter of 1941-1942, although disease and long-term malnutrition effects persisted throughout 1943. Industrial output inside the city increased as fuel and raw material deliveries became more regular. Armament production resumed partial normalcy under continued emergency conditions. Politically, both commands characterized the conclusion of the operation in terms of broader strategic context. Soviet leadership emphasized the restoration of ground communication with Leningrad as a critical structural shift. German command reframed the situation as a controlled shortening of the front rather than a collapse, while privately acknowledging that the siege could no longer be maintained in its original form. The withdrawal phase marked the practical end of the closed operational blockade system that had defined Leningrad's condition since September 1941. Although the city remained under threat and partial encirclement persisted, the strategic isolation that had driven the catastrophe of the earlier siege period had been decisively broken. The long-term significance of the January 1943 breakthrough extended far beyond the narrow land corridor that was physically opened along the southern shore of Lake Ladoga. While the siege of Leningrad was not fully lifted until January 1944, the partial restoration of ground communication marked a structural transformation of the northern theater of war. From this point forward, Leningrad ceased to exist as a fully isolated fortress city and became an integrated, though still threatened, component of the Soviet logistical and strategic system. The operational consequences unfolded gradually throughout 1943. The new railway connection enabled sustained industrial activity inside the city, supplying frontline formations while maintaining basic urban functions. Evacuation capacity increased dramatically, allowing the removal of large segments of the weakened civilian population. By the end of 1943, hundreds of thousands of residents had been transported out through the restored land routes. This reduced internal mortality and freed food supplies for the remaining population and garrison forces. From a military perspective, the restored corridor reshaped the operational geometry of the entire northern front. Soviet forces were no longer compelled to dedicate overwhelming proportions of manpower and material solely to the survival of the city. The Leningrad front gradually transitioned from emergency defense to active offensive planning. This shift contributed to later operations in 1943 and 1944 that ultimately forced German forces out of the entire northwestern Soviet territory. For German command, the failure to maintain the complete blockade imposed long-term strategic constraints. The 18th Army was compelled into a static defensive role without realistic prospects of restoring the siege. Resources allocated to containing Leningrad were no longer delivering decisive strategic returns. Over time, the northern sector became a secondary priority relative to the expanding crises in Ukraine, Belarus, and eventually the Baltic states. The civilian experience shaped the legacy of the operation as profoundly as its military outcome. The reopening of the land connection did not erase the effects of the famine, cold, and disease that had defined daily life for more than a year. Long-term demographic losses remained embedded in the city's post-war structure. Industrial recovery, urban rebuilding, and population return occurred slowly and unevenly over several years after the war. The breakthrough also entered the cultural and political memory of both sides in distinct ways. In the Soviet historical narrative, the January 1943 operation was framed as the moment when the fatal trajectory of the siege was reversed. Commemorative symbols, monuments, and annual remembrance events focused on the restoration of the land connection as the first tangible step toward full liberation. Military units that participated in the breakthrough received honorary designations tied to the Ladoga corridor and the surrounding settlements. In German post-war military analysis, the failure to restore the blockade after the Soviet breakthrough was usually treated as an example of the limitations of static positional defense under sustained multi-front pressure. Studies emphasize the strain imposed by concurrent operations across the Eastern Front and the diminishing ability of German command to allocate reserves where they were most urgently required. From a broader historical perspective, the January 1943 operation demonstrated the transformation of the Eastern Front into a war of sustained material and human mobilization. The outcome was not decided by maneuver alone, but by the cumulative capacity to concentrate artillery, sustain logistics under extreme conditions, and absorb heavy losses over compressed time periods. The battle also highlighted the increasing asymmetry of strategic endurance between the two sides as the war entered its final 2 years. The corridor along Lake Ladoga remains today not only a geographic feature but a symbolic marker of transition. It represents the moment when a city pushed to the limits of survival began its gradual return to functional integration with the wider world. The Siege of Leningrad stands as one of the defining humanitarian and military episodes of the 20th century, and the breakthrough of January 1943 occupies a central place in understanding how that prolonged catastrophe finally began to unwind.